workshop. I want to begin by telling you that the workshop itself will be being recorded. And at the end of the presentation, we will have the presentation put up on our website. During the course of the presentation,
Okay,
we'll
great.
be
Stop.
stopping briefly for questions throughout the presentation, as well as entertaining questions in the chat. So
Perfect.
please feel free to drop any questions you have.
Thank you.
And it looks like we have a full house, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I apologize for that. We had a technical glitch there, but we're ready to go. Okay, like I said, this is the technical assistance workshop for the NOFA HED.203.1 for the Home Investment Partnership American Rescue Plan. And the statement of purpose for this funding is to provide for the development of multifamily rental housing units, permanent supportive housing units, and transitional housing units and residential facilities that will serve a qualifying population. The funding that is available is $7,891,211, and it's federal home ARP funds. And this funding is coming from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So these are federal dollars. The eligible projects that will be funded under this program are going to be new construction of multifamily housing, which will include redevelopment, as well as acquisition and rehab of existing multifamily residential properties, and also the conversion of non-residential properties into housing and residential facilities that will be for qualifying populations. Home ownership projects and single-family housing will not be eligible under this particular NOFA. The multifamily will be 5 or more units. That's important to remember. And the acquisition rehab has to be acquisition rehab. But we will not entertain just rehabilitation of existing projects. It has to be acquisition and rehab. Again, there's no home ownership projects or scattered sites that will be eligible under this program. For the eligible projects, the new construction of multifamily housing. Multifamily housing is defined as 5 or more units located on a single property under common ownership. I'm going to stress again, it has to be 5 or more units, and they have to be located on a single property and all be commonly owned. So there will be no scattered sites under this program. All the projects must result in an increase in the county's affordable housing inventory, either through the construction of new housing units on a vacant site or redevelopment of an existing developed property that will increase the residential density. The acquisition and rehabilitation of existing properties is our second eligible project. It's the acquisition rehab of existing multifamily residential properties and the conversion of non-residential properties into housing and residential facilities for qualifying populations. Examples of that would be like your permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, non-congregate shelters. You can also have conversion projects, which would result in the creation of a single room occupancy. And you have to remember that properties that currently have affordability requirements of any federal, state, or local programs are going to be ineligible under this NOFA. Again, under the acquisition rehab of existing properties, multifamily is defined as 5 or more units, and these units must be occupied by a qualifying population, which we'll go into momentarily. All the projects must increase the local inventory of affordable housing units and our residential facilities serving qualifying populations. And all the projects must be completed and in service within 3 years of the funding award. Are there any questions about the eligible projects under this program? Okay, I don't see any, and there's none in the chat. So we'll move on to qualifying populations. Like I said earlier, the funds must be used to benefit qualifying populations. Those populations are the homeless as defined in 24 CFR 91.5. Another qualifying population is those that are at risk of homelessness as defined in 24 CFR 95.5. Also, if you have a population that's fleeing domestic violence, sexual assault, or human trafficking, that is a qualifying population under this program. And those folks that are the greatest risk of housing instability, they're also classified as a qualifying population. The first definition was the homeless per 24 CFR 91.5. That is defined as an individual or family who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. This would also include your unsheltered as well as sheltered individuals and families. And those that would be in shelters like emergency shelter or transitional shelters would qualify under this particular definition. The next is those that are at risk of homelessness per 24 CFR 91.5. And that is defined as an individual or a household that has an annual income at or below 30% area median income and lacks the sufficient resources or support network to prevent them from becoming homeless. And they have to meet one of the following definitions. So they have to be at that 30% AMI and meet one of these other requirements. And the first requirement would be that individual or household has to have moved 2 or more times during the last 60 days because of an economic issue. That person can also be living in the home of another because of an economic hardship. That would be your couch surfers or somebody staying at a relative's house or a friend's house because they simply cannot afford to find a place on their own. They also can be notified in writing that their right to occupy their current housing or living situation will be terminated within 21 days after they've applied for homeless prevention assistance. This would be in a lot of cases where you see the eviction notices. A person would also qualify at the at risk of homelessness if they meet that 30% AMI and they presently live in a hotel or motel, and the cost of that hotel or motel is not paid for by a charitable organization or by any federal, state, or local government income grant. Another definition of at risk of homelessness is if that person meets the income guidelines as well as he or she lives in a single room occupancy or efficiency apartment in which there resides 2 or more persons, or they live in a larger housing unit in which there's more than 1.5 people per room as defined by the US Census Bureau. This simply is overcrowding. If you live in a place where it's meant for 4 people and there's like presently like 6 or 8 in there, that person would qualify under this definition. The last definition of at risk of homelessness would be the income, as well as if that person is exiting a publicly funded institution or system of care, such as a healthcare facility, a mental health care facility, if you have youth that are currently aging out of a foster care program, or if they are leaving a correctional program or an institution and they meet that 30% AMI, they would qualify under the at risk of homelessness category. The third group of qualifying populations are those individuals that are fleeing domestic violence, sexual assault, or human trafficking. And that is defined as any individual or a family who is fleeing or is attempting to flee domestic violence or dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking. This would also include cases where an individual or family believes that there is a threat of danger or harm or further violence due to a dangerous or life-threatening condition that is related to violence against the individual or a family member that has taken place in that family or individual's primary nighttime residence and has made that person feel unsafe to return or remain within that dwelling unit. The last category of qualifying populations would be those that are at greatest risk of housing instability. And this would be a family member, a family, or an individual that has an annual income at or below 50% AMI and meets one of those conditions that were listed in the second group of at risk of homelessness as defined at 24 CFR 91.5. Those were if you have 50% AMI and you're couch surfing, you've had to move twice, that list of qualifiers would make you be part of the qualifying populations at this definition. Are there any questions regarding the qualifying populations that are allowed under this program? Eligible applicants for this program are going to be housing developers and owners, and that will include any not-for-profit organization, for-profit organizations, public agencies, and any partnerships between the same. Eligible uses for this funding will be the development cost of multifamily housing and residential facilities. Remember, multifamily housing is defined as 5 or more units, and they will include the acquisition of existing structures. Remember, under the acquisition rehab, it's acquisition and rehab, architectural and engineering costs, permitting, site improvements, constructions, and establishment of an initial operating reserve. The purchase of vacant land is ineligible under this program. And all operational cost or tenant rental subsidies is also an ineligible use. And the developer and owner is going to be responsible for the operation of the property through the affordability period, including any operating subsidies. Are there any questions regarding the eligible uses? The affordability requirements. All the home ARP assisted units will bear affordability requirements of the home ARP program for no less than 30 years. The affordability requirements will be secured by an encumbrance on the title to the property. So all these units have to be held for 30 years to meet the affordability requirements. So it's 30 years. During that 30-year period, there are specific guidelines on who can occupy the property and what the rents can be. For the new construction of multifamily housing, all the units or a portion of the units can be home ARP assisted. Of the home ARP assisted units, up to 30% of the total number within the project can be restricted for occupancy by low income tenants. Low income tenants are those that are at or below 80% AMI. And the balance of the home ARP assisted units must be restricted by occupancy for qualifying populations. So for example, if you had a 50-unit housing project and you set aside 10 units to be home ARP assisted units, you can have up to 30% or 3 of those 10 units can be restricted for occupancy by low income tenants. They can be, but the balance must be occupied by a qualifying population. For the new construction of multifamily units, the rents for units that are occupied by a qualifying population cannot exceed HUD's issued home ARP rent limits, which is 50% or below AMI less the utility allowance. The exception to this would be for units that will be receiving tenant-based rental subsidies, which have rents up to the maximum allowed under the subsidy program. So for new construction, those units that are occupied by a qualifying population, the maximum rent that can be charged would be the home ARP rent limits of 50% and below AMI, with the exception of if that unit is attached to a tenant-based rental subsidy, in which the rental subsidy maximum would be allowed. For the units for multifamily housing that are occupied by the low income tenants, which again is at or below 80% AMI, those rents cannot exceed the lesser of the applicable HUD fair market rent or the home 65 AMI rent limits, less the utility allowance. Again, the exception is the units that receive a tenant-based subsidy, which may have rents up to the maximum allowed under that subsidy program. For the acquisition rehab of existing properties, their affordability period's a little different. All the units must be considered home ARP assisted units and must be restricted to occupancy by qualifying populations. These projects can be operated as a customary rental housing program and offer occupancy through a standard lease at affordable rents, or they may also be transitional housing or non-congregate shelters. For the purpose of this NOFA, the non-congregate shelter is defined as one or more buildings that will provide private units or rooms as temporary shelter to individuals and families, and they do not require an executed lease or agreement. An example of this would be like your transitional housing facilities or perhaps an emergency shelter facility. For the rents that are allowed under the acquisition and rehab of existing properties category, like I said, all these units are considered home ARP assisted. All have to be occupied by a qualifying population, and the rents cannot exceed the home ARP rent limits of at or below 50% AMI, less the utility allowance. Again, the exception is the units that will be receiving tenant-based rental subsidies, which you can have rents up to the maximum allowed under that subsidy program. Rents in the SRO units that contain both sanitary and food preparation facilities cannot exceed the HUD 0-bedroom fair market rent less the utility allowance. And rents in SRO units that contain only sanitary facilities cannot exceed 75% of the HUD 0-bedroom fair market rent less the utility allowance. We have listed here the income limits for the 80% AMI, 50% AMI, and 30% AMI. For these income limits are for 2023. In the NOFA itself, we had listed the income limits for 2022 because the new limits had not come out. A week ago today, the 2023 unit income limits did come out. So they are in the presentation today. This presentation will be placed on our website after the meeting this morning. So you'll be able to access the current income limits of 2023. We've also have the 2023 rent limits chart. And again, we have this chart in the NOFA itself, but it was for 2022. Last week, along with the income limits, the rent limits came out. So these are the new rent limits. These are the maximum allowable rent that is applicable rent units, of course, less the allowance for tenant paid utilities. And we have the 50% AMI as well as the 65% AMI rent limits. Are there any questions regarding the affordability periods and how the rents and who can occupy what type of project? Okay, the location requirements for the home ARP housing program. This is a countywide program. Projects can be located within any municipality or any unincorporated area of Palm Beach County. If you have a project that is going to be located within the city limits of West Palm Beach, the city must make a financial contribution to the project. The reason for this is the city received their own home ARP funding, and we want to make sure that if we fund a project within the city limits, that they kick in a little bit of their home ARP money too. The funding terms for this project, the minimum award is going to be $250,000, and there is no maximum amount that you can apply for. For new construction of multifamily housing, the funding will be in the form of low interest loans. These loans will require repayment of all principal and interest. For the acquisition rehabilitation of existing properties project types, the funding can be provided as a forgivable loan or a low interest loan. The forgivable loans will bear no interest and require no debt service. The principal will be forgiven upon maturity, contingent on compliance with all the home ARP regulations during the 30-year affordable period. The leveraging portion, there is no limit on the amount of home ARP funds that can be requested. Again, the minimum that can be requested is $250,000. All the projects must demonstrate a minimum 25% match from non-county development funding sources. Applicants must document commitments from all other funding sources as well as developmental funding, including any sources of any necessary operating subsidy. So you will need to, in your application, make sure that you document any funding commitments that you have from other sources. Are there any questions thus far? Okay, let's go over some important dates that you're going to want to keep in mind as you are developing your projects and putting together your application. We are going to begin accepting applications on Monday, June 12th. That says 2022, it should be 2023 at 9 a.m. The applications process will continue and they will be accepted until all home ARP funding has been awarded to eligible projects. The application cycle is going to be a first come, first eligible, first funded basis. The funded projects must be completed within 3 years from the date of the funding award. So again, beginning Monday, June 12th at 2023 at 9 a.m., the applications can be submitted to our department, HED, beginning that Monday, and we will continue accepting applications until such time all the home ARP funding has been awarded. The submittal requirements include a complete cover sheet, which you'll find in your packet, a detailed project description, and the detailed project description, make sure you include the development type, the number of units, and the number of home ARP assisted units, as well as the qualifying populations you will be serving. We will also need a developer owner experience with similar projects description, an organizational chart that identifies all the owners. We will also need evidence of site control. Site control can be a recorded deed, a fully executed contract for purchase, an option to purchase, or even a long-term lease. A detailed development pro forma needs to be submitted, along with documentation of all non-county funding sources. You will also need to include a detailed 15-year operating pro forma and any documentation of operating subsidies that you will be having for your project. We will also require a detailed project or implementation schedule, as well as we ask that you detail information on the development approval process, such as if your project requires permitting or a land change or a variance to zoning. We would need information on that, as well as where exactly you are in that process. The submittal format, you must submit one original wet signed copy and 2 photocopies of the application and all the required documentation. We ask that you put it on a single side paper no larger than 8.5 by 11 in a binder and identify or tab sections. And we also would need 1 electronic copy of the application in PDF file format on a DVD or USB flash drive or jump drive. Are there any questions on how the submittal process should work? Okay, once we receive your application, we, staff, will review them in the order that they've received. We are going to review them for eligibility and responsiveness to the NOFA submittal requirements. If your application does not meet the NOFA submittal requirements, you will receive a non-responsive letter from us. You may then reapply and resubmit your application, but keep in mind that it will be processed in the order the new application is received. So if you are the very first one to submit something and it's deemed unresponsive, we give it back to you. You can correct whatever was non-responsive, submit it back to us, but you may be the 4th or 5th application now, because it's going to be the first come, first eligible, first funded. The funding awards are tentatively going to go before the Board of County Commissioners. Right now, we're looking at an August 22, 23 meeting date. We are hoping to have everything done and completed at that time. A funding agreement will be executed and funds will become available when all project development funding closes. You have to remember that this is federal dollars, so all applicable federal regulations will apply to these agreements, and that will include your Davis-Bacon, Section 3. Environmental reviews will need to be conducted prior to entering into an agreement. And all these projects will be monitored at least annually for compliance with the occupancy, which would be your qualifying populations, and to ensure that affordability are being met and the correct rents are being charged. Are there any questions at this time? Like I said earlier, this presentation will be posted on the HED website, and that is our website address, discover.pbcgov.org/HED. We will also collect the questions that were submitted through the chat, and we will also have them available on the website. If you have any questions or wish to, as you're going along, have anything you want to discuss or have questions that pop up while you're putting together your application, this is my contact information. My direct line is 561-233-3620. My email, ejmiller@pbcgov.org, as well as you can submit your questions through HED-submit@pbcgov.org. Things I would remind you about is that the gist of the program is to increase the inventory of affordable housing, and these units are geared toward those qualifying populations. And we will be accepting applications beginning Monday, June 12th at our offices at 100 Australian Avenue. Are there any questions at this time?
Hi, good morning,
I
Joe.
thank you for your time. I thank you for your interest in this program. And again, if you have any questions, you can contact myself, and we will be putting this presentation as well as any questions and answers that we received in the chat online shortly. Thank you for your attendance.